In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how the treble and the bass clefs are applied to the staff. In the previous lesson, we took a careful look at how the movable C clef applies in terms of the soprano, the alto, and the tenor registers or ranges. Here, we're going to take a look specifically at treble and bass, and then take a look at some of the more unusual cases of the baritone and the mezzo-soprano. In fact, let's begin with the latter, just because we were on the topic of that movable C clef, so we might as well finish off that before looking at treble and bass. So you remember that this symbol by itself is simply called the C clef. And the reason for that is because these arches always meet at some line, and wherever that line is will be called C4. So here are the soprano, the alto, and the tenor clefs as we know them. This one is the soprano clef. This one is the alto clef. Remember, that's actually, it goes the other way. That's the contralto. And then this one is, yeah, it should be a little bit neater here. I don't want to rush through this. And this one is the tenor. So what you'll notice is that there are 3 clefs, but there are also 5 lines on the staff. So in other words, 2 lines have not been utilized as far as where those arches could meet. What are those lines that have not yet been utilized? Well, one of them is this one, line number 2, not been used yet. And the other line is line number 5. It hasn't been used yet. So let's find a place to indicate those missing 2 very rarely used clefs, the baritone and the mezzo-soprano. So let's look at this one first, the one where the arches would meet at line number 2. So if I put the clef right there, again, the arches are meeting at line number 2, which range would this be? Would this be the mezzo-soprano or the baritone? And the answer is this would have to be the mezzo-soprano, because this is telling us, again, making sure, mezzo-soprano, making sure that you understand what the question really means. For this person, C4, which is right there, is toward the bottom of the register, of the range. And that means that this person sings basically above C4, but doesn't bottom out at C4. In fact, what would be the lowest note as indicated on the staff for the mezzo-soprano? Well, do you already recognize that this interval from the second line to the space below the staff is a fourth, right? This is one of those things we've been practicing because, first of all, very quick review. C4 is on a line, correct? C4 is on a line. The space below the staff is obviously on a space. So if we have a line and a space, the interval size will have to be even, not odd. And the reason that I know so quickly that this is a fourth is because, here, let me make some room here, is because this looks a lot to me like a skip, that's a skip, plus a step. So if you can remember that, because we've done it multiple times in previous lessons, then this is a fourth. So because 3 plus 2 minus the overlap at line number 1. What's a fourth below C4? I'll give you a moment to think about that. You can always simply proceed down the alphabet. C4, and then I'm going to forget about octave designation for a second just to make this faster. C, down to B, down to A, down to G. C, B, A, G. 1, 2, 3, 4. We know that once we go below C4, we're in the 3rd octave. So this is G3. And what is an 11th, or the space above the staff? What's an 11th above the mezzo-soprano? Well, remember that all we have to do is go from G3 up a fourth, and then from there up an octave. All right, so we go up a fourth, and then from there up an octave, and we'll get our answer. Well, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? Because we've already gone down a fourth to figure out G3, and because intervals are just like addition, they're commutative, then we can just go right back to where we were, which is C4 plus an octave is C5. So this, well, it's getting a little cramped, isn't it? Let's see, I can do a lasso tool, right? I can move this. Oh, how convenient. Okay, so this is C5, the space above the staff, and that, if you look carefully, should be an 11th. In fact, not should be, it is an 11th above G3. So the mezzo-soprano covers a range of G3 up to C5 as indicated on the staff. Let's take a look at the last one. That's this one right here. So this is where middle C would meet if we indicate the baritone, right? That would be the baritone clef, okay? So why does this make sense as the baritone? Because what it tells us is that for the baritone, C4 is toward the very top of the range, and everything that's notated on the staff below is really more within the comfortable range of this singer. So C4 is toward the top, and the rest of the notes are below. So let's do the same thing we've been doing with our other exercises, which is simply what's the full range on the staff, right, from the bottom to the top. So this one is actually pretty simple because we know that from the fifth line, C4, up a step to the space directly above it is just going to be C up to D. So D4 is the very top of the baritone's range as indicated on the staff using this clef. What is an 11th below D4? Okay, so it's not that hard, right? Because we can engineer it the same way we did for the mezzo-soprano. Meaning we start with D4, and what we're going to do is we're going to go down an octave and down a fourth, or down a fourth and down an octave. It really doesn't matter because once again, it's a commutative property here in terms of intervals, right? So why don't we start with the easier one? Let's go down an octave. So -8, and our answer is going to be D3. From there, let's go down a fourth. Okay, so what is a fourth below D? Well, take away the octave designation and just go in reverse alphabetical order. D down to C, C down to B, B down to A. D, C, B, A, 1, 2, 3, 4. Have we crossed C as we moved down a fourth from D? Yes, which means that in terms of octave designations, the A that we're going to land on, remember D, C, B, A, has to be in the octave below the third one, which is the second octave. Right? So it goes D3, C3, B2, and then finally A2. So this note head all the way at the bottom of the staff is going to be A2. And A2 all the way up to D4, A2 up to D4 is a range of 11, and that covers the baritone's range using the staff and the movable C clef in baritone position, okay, all the way up at the fifth line. Now, I just want you to remember these, mezzo-soprano and baritone, are infrequently used relative to soprano, alto, and the tenor clefs. Okay, so now that we've reviewed all of the C clefs, which remember are movable, let's deal with the two that are no longer movable. They may have been in history. You can see certain manuscripts by, in my memory, I remember looking at some manuscripts by Johann Sebastian Bach, who died in 1750. So we are talking about really a composer from not exactly from recent history, but remember from the Baroque and early classical period. And some of his manuscripts have the treble clef positioned differently from how it's used today. But I digress. Let's focus on how these clefs are used in the present. So the first clef, remember, is this one called the treble. Let's focus on that right now. The reference pitch for the treble clef is G4. How do I know? Well, we go back to that diagram that we had earlier, right, on another page. And so if A0 is on the bottom and C8 is on the top, well, C4 is in the middle, roughly. We know that everything from C4 up is going to be the treble register. So if G is the reference pitch, it has to be at least G4 or higher. Keyboards evolved over a long time, and they were narrower first before they became wider. So some of the upper Gs, like for example G7, simply weren't present on early keyboards in the 17th century, for example, or the 18th century. And furthermore, these clefs still originate to some extent with what people could actually sing, even if some of these were instruments that didn't require the limitations or didn't have the limitations of voice ranges. So it just makes sense that, in a kind of general way, that the reference pitch, if it's going to be G in the treble range, would have to be G4 and not anything particularly higher, because it would be outside of the range of what early keyboards could play, and it would be outside of the range of what most singers could sing. I'm speaking very generically. Obviously, there are exceptions, and if you really go into the historical record, there are going to be a number of nuances that will flesh out what I'm saying right now. But G4 is the reference. So the question is, when we apply this treble clef over to the staff, what does it look like? Well, here's what it looks like. You start around the second line, you draw that sort of lower belly, and then you come down. And that's the shape of the treble clef. And so that belly, right there, that belly seems to circle around line number 2. And that specifically is G4. Okay, now that is a fixed point. That's a fixed reference point. And this clef, again, in modern usage, does not move. So you don't have to worry about any kind of alternatives to the movable G clef like you did for the C clef. It's just the treble. Okay, it covers a very stable range. So in this case, knowing that this is G4, we can go right back to applying what we know about interval ranges, like what do unison steps, skips, and leaps look like on the staff, and we can practice. So for the treble, we can similarly do this. Here is the lowest note head that's in the vicinity of the staff, right? The space below the staff, all the way up to the space above the staff. What do we label these notes? Simply put. So first thing, and this is going to be very easy, is do you recognize from all the practice we've had, do you recognize what this interval size is from the second line to that space directly below? And I hope you do, because if so, this is a fourth. That's really convenient because we've done so much practice with this. What's a fourth below G? Just count. G, F, E, D. Right, here we go. I'm going to show it to you the way I used to do it. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Have we crossed C as we were counting down? No, right? It just went G, F, E, D. If we don't cross C, we don't have to change our octave designation. Because remember, the octave designation changes with C either going up or going down. So in this case, since we didn't cross C, we're still in the fourth octave. So this is D4. And what's an 11th above D4? Well, I don't need to belabor this anymore. You know that this interval is an octave, because an 11th is an octave plus a fourth. So this range of 11 means that we go up a fourth, up an octave, and so an octave above G4 is G5. And that's the range on the staff of the treble clef. Now something interesting comes up, and I'm pretty sure that you're thinking about this, because let's take this information and apply it to this diagram. So an octave above G4 is, right there, approximately G5. But do you notice how we have this range from G5 up to C8 that has not been utilized on the staff. So what if we're using the treble clef and I'd like to indicate, for example, oh, I don't know, something as innocent as a step above G5, which is A5. How do I do it? I mean, I don't have any more room on the staff. Well, this is where we go back to what we learned about in a previous lesson, which is when I need more lines and spaces, I draw them. So this is G5 right there on the treble staff. If I need to go a step above, I need to draw a line above that and put the note head on it, and that will be A5. Do you guys remember what this extra line is called? It is called a ledger line. That's the extra line above the staff. And if I need to use more of those lines, I draw them in. Let's save this extra ledger line drawing session for another time. Let's examine one more thing before we move on to the bass clef. I know that this first space below the staff using the treble clef is D4. What about C4? I mean, after all, didn't we talk about the treble range starting on C4? Well, it similarly looks like I can't indicate C4 unless I use a ledger line. So let's do that. Here we are at D4. What's a step below? Well, a step below this space would have to be some sort of line. So I need to draw it, that extra line below the staff, that's a ledger line. I put my note head directly on it, and that is C4. Now, if I had to go lower, I just keep drawing the ledger lines as needed. For example, what if I wanted to step below C4? Remember, a step below C4 is B3. That's B3, right? You see how that note head right there is directly below the first ledger line below the staff. What if I want to skip below C4? Here's C4, a skip below. This is A3, which also happens to be a step below B3, right? All of this is review from what we had done earlier when we were just focusing on the lines and the spaces on the staff. Nothing changes if you're adding those ledger lines. The only thing that changes, of course, is that it's a bit messier to read them because your eyes tend to focus on the information that is more readily apparent. I mean, the staff has these long horizontal lines and the spaces between. The ledger lines are pretty short, as you can see, and if I'm drawing them in by hand, it can get a little bit messy. So that's why I prefer not to worry about ledger lines until you feel more comfortable with just reading standard staff notation for treble and bass. So we've covered the treble clef, and we can do one more little thing, which is kind of fun because generally this is how children learn to do this, or people really early in their music education. So I'm going to throw this in just for fun. Oops, I don't want the highlight, I want this. So here's another G clef. And some of you, if you've ever had a background in music, might be thinking that I'm omitting one interesting piece of information, which is, doesn't this clef kind of look like the letter G? Yes, the origins of that name, the G clef, have to do with the fact that this is a stylized letter G. So you have to really squint for this one, or take a couple of shots, but let's see. G, and then you add a line, and that is the treble clef. So it's called the G clef not only because it encircles the second line, which becomes automatically your reference of G4, but because the clef, from a kind of calligraphy standpoint, looks like a stylized letter G. All right, but that actually wasn't the fun part. The fun part, I mean, that is kind of fun. But the fun part I was referring to was let's put down a bunch of Here, let me erase this because I want to make sure that, I don't know why I keep saying erase. See, this is what I was talking about in another lesson. Old habits die hard. I'm constantly thinking that I have this finite canvas because of my work as a teacher in front of a classroom using an actual whiteboard. But I have unlimited space here, right? So, okay, I'm going to put down that treble clef. By the way, do you notice how every time I draw it, whether it's this one, or this one, it looks just a little bit different? Completely normal, right? I'm not I'm not a piece of software that's going to draw it exactly the same. So when you draw your own treble clefs, if they all look slightly different from one another, it's completely natural. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to draw all of the note heads on the lines. So line number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now remember, this is G4. That's our anchor point. That's our reference pitch. A skip below line number 1, that's easy. That's E4. A skip above G4 is B4. A skip above B4, which necessitates crossing C, right? You go B4, C5, right? And then one more step is D5. So I'm bringing this up because we change octave designations. And then a skip above D5 is F5. So if you ever studied music as a kid, maybe you had those, I don't know, it seems like every school in America at least does this, where you have those required recorder lessons. By the way, I had them in fourth grade and in fifth grade, and I was terrible, terrible at it. I couldn't stop laughing every time I tried playing that instrument. I don't know, it was some sort of weird reaction I had to it. But anyway, you might remember that when you learned to play that instrument, you learned about the treble clef and you applied a little bit of this acronym for all the letters on the staff lines, E, G, B, D, F. Do you remember what that acronym stood for? Every good boy does fine. Do you remember that one? Maybe you knew this one. Every good boy deserves fudge. Yeah, these are really old by this point and kind of weird, and I always invite my students to make up their own. So, and yet, of course, as I'm trying to remember what my students come up with, I actually forget the acronyms they've used, but they've been very creative. Something like each giant bear doesn't. Well, I'll leave the next one to I'll leave the next one to your imagination. I don't know. I'll be honest. I don't remember what the F stood for. Well, I do, but it's a YouTube. It's a YouTube friendly environment. I don't want to say too much, but you come up with your own acronym, right? If you want to use those archaic ones, every good boy does fine or deserves fudge, go for it. How about those spaces? Well, let's see. The spaces, well, if the first line is E4, right there, then the space directly above it is going to be a step above that, which is F4, and now we start skipping up, right? F4, A4, skip up to C. Well, that begins the next octave, so C5 and E5. Well, that one's easy. It's not even an acronym. It's just a word, face. But if you want to come up with an acronym, go for it. Be my guest. Leave it down in the comments. I suppose I should say keep it clean, but I can't really regulate that in the YouTube's space. So you do what you have to so that you know that this is FACE. Those are the spaces using the treble clef. Well, I guess we can add two more, right? What about the space below and the space above? Well, I mean, we know that. We've already done those. They're right here. Remember, we did D4 on the bottom, G5 on the top. So D4, G5. So if we add these together and we go from D4 up, we'll go D, F, A, C, E, G. Well, what could that stand for? Don't fool around, class, or everyone gets it. Okay, no, that was very awkward. But I'm trying. I'm just not so creative on the spot. You guys figure it out for yourself. Either way, we've got all of our lines and spaces labeled using the treble clef. Okay, let's move on to the bass clef. Okay, so the bass clef is an interesting one because here's what it looks like when it's applied to the staff. It's got those two dots, and those two dots that I just drew in, they circle around, or they exist around line number 4. And line number 4 automatically becomes your reference pitch, which in this case is F3. Okay, how do I know that? Well, remember there are two reasons why any clef is called by a letter. One is the reference pitch. That's really the one to remember. The other one is because the shape of the clef is a stylized, in terms of calligraphy, letter. So just like that G clef right there was a stylized G, the F clef is a stylized letter F. Don't believe me? Okay, well, let's see. Here's F. Pretend there are some dots there. That's a stylized F. I mean, you could say, well, that looks like a stylized 7. All right, fair enough. Or this looks like an ear with 2 cartilage piercings. And I don't know. Maybe these clefs were invented at a time when people weren't getting their cartilage pierced. I don't know. The point is, the F clef is named because of the reference pitch, F3, and because it looks like a stylized letter F. And why F3 as opposed to some other F? Well, go back to this diagram where we know that the range from C4 down to A0 is the bass. And we know that any F in this range has to be below the 4th octave. So here's F3, and the reason we're not worried about F2 or F1, for example, is just because that would be a bit outside of most vocal ranges, right? Most vocal ranges, and because the keyboard, as it evolved in history, started more narrow than it did wide. I'll give you an example. Take a look at the clavichord, right? A very, very small portable keyboard instrument that was popular several centuries ago. Okay, so do that research on your own time if you want, but let's go back to this F clef and just figure out how to label the letters on the staff, on the bass staff. So we know that our reference pitch is F3. What we're going to do is we're going to apply that same little game of naming the acronyms by labeling all the lines and spaces. So here we go. First line, second, third, fourth, that's our reference, and fifth. So notice that this is fairly simple to do because all we have to do is kind of use this as our reference because we know, for example, what a skip above F is, right? A skip above F4 is A4, so therefore a skip above F3 on the 4th line of the bass staff is going to be A3. Right? And now let's just keep going down. So a skip below A is F. What's a skip below F? F-E-D. If only I could write. Let me try that again. D3. What's a skip below D3? D-C-B. Question is, which B? Well, the answer has to be B2 because we've crossed that threshold of C. We went D3, C3. Below it is B2. And finally, what's a skip below B? Going backwards, B-A-G, so the answer is G2. So these are the labels for all the lines of the bass staff. Okay, I remember one of my classes coming up with this. Giant bears don't fool around. Yeah, of course they said fool around. You'll use your imagination. Giant bears don't fool around. Okay, here's the archaic one, the one that I grew up with, maybe some of you too. Good boys deserve fudge always. Yeah, sure they do. Okay, let's take a look at the spaces. So we're going to start with the spaces that are in between the lines. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. We know that the top line is A3. A step below that is going to be G3. Let's skip down. G skipping down is E3. E3 skipping down, EDC is C5. C3. And finally, skipping down from C3 is A. Well, you tell me with the octave designation, is it A3? No, because A3 is right there. It's an octave below. And of course, we're below C3, so it has to be the next octave down, A2. So there are our spaces. And this one, also the archaic acronym, all cows eat grass. But let's add the space below and the space above. So a skip below F, I'm sorry, again, my mouth is ahead of my brain. A skip below A2 is F2, and going back to the top, a skip above G3 is B3. So that's the range for the bass staff. Notice how we came across the answers here differently from before, but they're still correct. So the bass staff extends from F2 down here all the way up to B3 up there, and we know that that is a range of 11, and we also immediately recognize, God, I hope that you're doing this. You remember that the fourth line is F3? Well, that's an octave, and guess what this is? From F3 up to B3. That's a fourth, and you know why. Because it looks like a fourth, it's a skip plus a step, or a step plus a skip, and you should just get familiar with the visual appearance of fourths because we've done them so many times by this point. All right, so before we leave this lesson, we're still using the Bass Clef here, and what acronym should we assign to all of these spaces starting on F2? I don't know. I guess you guys have to think about it. I have to think about it. ACEG was all cows eat grass, so fancy that. All cows eat grass. Bam. Okay, that's so stupid. I just don't know. What I want to say is massively inappropriate for this space. So I'm just going to leave it at that, and you will figure out your own acronyms for reading the treble and the bass staves. Remember, that's the plural of staff.